really want to make sure that in the conversation we have today, that we have a level of candor and engagement. I am open to any questions that you might want to ask about anything that I both talk about and things that I don't mention. And what I wanted to do today, after I heard from Alana and talked to one of my other dear friends and colleagues here, Dr. Niambi Carter, and said, oh, okay, we're gonna talk about Black history. I am not a historian. I joke with people all the time. I am intimidated by historians. If you ask me to remember anything before 1979, it gets really iffy, right? But what I can do, and what I can talk about with a tremendous amount of confidence besides sort of general politics, is I want to talk about sort of public discourse and the role that Black political analysts and public intellectuals play in our current conversations in this country. I have seen radical changes in my lifetime, and we're at an inflection point, not just this year with this election, but moving forward with technology in general. And that'll be the focus of my talk today. And I think it is extremely important that as we sort of engage the subject matter, that we think about not only our responsibilities as scholars and academics, but our responsibilities as just like regular people who are often called upon by our friends and colleagues to explain what the heck's happening in the world, because they probably call on you because they assume that you know what's going on. So that being said, a brief history of the beginning and the end of Black political analysts. Start with this. What is a political analyst? We've always had public intellectuals, right? There have always been, you got Angela Davis and James Baldwin, Julian Bond. There have always been smart, capable Black people writing in radio, early stages of television, who were called upon to discuss or analyze or present a different perspective on what was happening politically in the world. That's not new, that's not unique, that's not special. But what we've experienced for the last 20 to 25 years is a change in what is expected and the access and the reach of Black political analysts. Usually, prior to the 1990s, what you had was there would be a Black person who was a politician, or a Black person who was an activist, or a Black person who was an organizer. And large media organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, long before Fox News, would occasionally deign to allow said Black person to come in for 3.5 minutes and do an interview and talk about something that probably specifically affected Black people, but Black folks were not usually in the room allowed to say anything. And that was most of the history of political analysis in this country. So in the 1980s, I'm loud.
Yeah.
You do. Yeah. It's funny. This is the voice that scares people when I call because they're like, "Wait, are you a bill collector?" No, this is just me. Literally how I talk on a regular basis. So what happened in the 1980s that sort of changed the role of Black political analysts, and again, not purely public intellectuals. I'll talk about the distinction, but Black political analysts was the campaign of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, right? And sort of underneath that, the rise of Black mayors in Chicago and several other major cities. And what happened is you had large newspapers and some nightly news television networks who were like, we have no idea how this happened. We don't know anything about these Black people. We have no Black people on staff. The few Black people we get, we fire them, or we kick them out, or we muzzle them. So I guess if we're having a Black guy who might be the nominee, we might need to have some Black people in the room. Now, to be clear, Black people in the room meant 90% men. It was still another decade or two before you had any Black women who were brought in to talk about their expertise. But what you had at the time was sort of a generation of writers who had sort of started in the 70s and the 80s, who had established themselves as sort of political analysts at the local level, who were sometimes called into sort of the big leagues of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Sun-Times, and sometimes ABC Nightly News. So you had Chuck Stone, Philadelphia Daily News. He was a long-term writer. He had been part of the White House press corps. Anybody here ever hear of Chuck Stone? Okay, so a couple people heard of Chuck Stone. For those who are millennials or Generation Xers, you may not know of Chuck Stone, but you probably know of the incredibly annoying earworm that his son invented. His son is the one who directed the What's Up commercials. Yeah, that was his son. Chuck was a nice guy. His son, I was like, why'd you do this? Why'd you do this to all of us? There was Julia Scott Reed, who was the first black reporter at the Dallas Morning News, and she had a weekly column where she would address important issues happening in the African American community. Again, Dallas has never had less than like 25–30% black population, but you either had a black newspaper, you didn't have many black anchors, so her role was very important. And occasionally, she was called upon to speak at larger news outlets, nightly news, et cetera, to talk about what was happening. You have Tony Brown, the famous Tony Brown's Journal. Now we have a video of that, we can bring that up. There we go. Show just a quick opening with this.
According to the polls, Governor Bill Clinton and President George Bush are in a statistical tie for the white vote, 44 to 43%. Clinton's entire national lead of 7 to 18 points, depending on the poll, is accounted for by the black vote. Clinton leads Bush by 15 to 1 among blacks, and blacks will cast almost 25% of all Democratic votes. Blacks comprise a very important, and in the case of the Democratic Party, a very reliable voting bloc. Having said that, meaning who they will vote for, who should they vote for. I'm Tony Brown. In a moment, election 92, who should blacks vote for?
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you.
Now, Tony Brown's Journal was unique from the standpoint that not only was it created by a black journalist and started on PBS, but it was nationally syndicated. It was the first example of a nationally syndicated news